Hi, my lovelies. Welcome to session number 6. In this session, we are now moved from conformity and we're moving on to obedience. So this is a different section within the social influence. The spec says we've got to understand what is obedience. So we need to be able to define it, but also look at it, obedience as investigated by Milgram. Again, Milgram is a key name. You can set up a key study sheet for this one because, again, it's really important that you know the aims, procedures, findings, conclusion, and the evaluation around it. Right, let's get a move on. If I can, there we go, it moved on. Okay, our first question is, what is obedience? We all know what it is because we all do it to a certain degree, but we need to know how to define it. So our definition of obedience is complying with, now please note, complying isn't conformity here, complying with or deferring to a request or an order from a legitimate authority. So that means we're carrying out an instruction from a person we believe who has a higher status than us. They are legitimate. So obedience occurs when you change your opinions, judgments, or action because someone in a position of authority told you to. So you've been given an instruction and then you are obeying that instruction. The key aspect to note about obedience is just that you have changed in some way. It does not mean that you agree with it. So you may change your opinion outwardly, but again, you might not actually agree with it, but you're doing it because you've been instructed to. You also feel that when you're being given this instruction from this legitimate authority, you feel that you have no other option to obey. So for example, a nice clear example of this, if we have somebody of seniority, a sergeant, a captain in the army, and it's giving an instruction to a private, they feel because they have seniority, again, a higher status, they must do as they are told. I thought I'd just throw in a nice exam question here. I know we've done lots of different exam questions, but I really want us to have more practice. So let's get my highlighting pen up and going. So our command word, explain. Explain, that means in some detail. We're going to do it in some depth. Explain also tells us that it's an AO1. But another word that's giving us an instruction is the word difference. It wants us to explain the difference. It doesn't want us to tell us what they are. This question is asking us to explain a difference. In this case, it's actually asking us to do two differences. Now, if we're looking at the idea of what the topic area is, we can actually see that we've got conformity and obedience. So that's our topic area. So the difference has to be between what is conformity and what is difference. Now, let's further break down the question into the idea of how many things is it asking us to do? Well, it's asking us to do two differences. Explain two key differences between. So it's asking us to do two. But then what does that tell us in terms of the marks? It's 6 marks. So we're asked to do two things, 6 marks. So that means it's 3 marks each. So explain the difference. How do we get these 3 marks each? 1, what is the difference? So we need to find something specific to show the difference. And then we need to explain that difference between the conformity and obedience. Now remember, when we're explaining the difference, we don't just say conformity is this and obedience is that. No, that's us just stating a key element of it. We've got to say conformity is this, whereas, or compared to, however, in contrast. We're showing the difference. We're using that connected word. But remember, the difference we've identified needs to be what we're identifying in the conformity and obedience with regards to it. So I'll give you a minute. Pause the video right now Come on, some of you, I don't want you to be cheating and just carrying on. Practice makes perfect. Pause it here. All you need right now is your key definition of what is conformity, your key definition of what is obedience, and you can answer this. So let's have a pause. Right. I left a little gap there in case you're kind of wondering why, just to make sure that you paused. Let's compare your answers to mine. Here I've got two different colors and you can see I've got two differences. Now state what the difference is first. A key difference is the cause that influences a person's behavior. Okay, the cause, that's the difference. We've identified what a difference is. Now we've got to explain that. Conformity is when a person changes their behavior due to the influence of or pressure of the majority of the group. So that's the cause. Again, we're not just stating it. We want to say whereas, compared to, we need to show the difference. Whereas obedience is when an individual changes because they have been told by a direct order of a legitimate authority figure. The cause, legitimate authority figure, the pressure of the group. Okay, so it's got to be the same. We can't bring in two different things there. Okay, so there's our 3 marks there. Second key difference. A second difference, it's always good, signposted in. A second difference is the status level of the individual or group. The person carrying out the order is usually of lower status and the person than the person giving the order. So we've got obedience here. It's a level of status, e.g. an army officer and a low-ranking soldier. However, people who conform, okay, so we're using the terminology, so conformity here, are of equal or similar status, for example, our friends. So again, our second difference is status. First difference is the cause, what causes us either to conform or obey, and it's the status of the person of the group that causes it. Right, so have a wee pause here again and compare it to your answer. Did you get your 6 marks? Again, like I said earlier, Milgram is a key name here, really important. We're going to be focusing on his original study. Just like Ash, Milgram did variations. He changed a variable, either a situational or a dispositional variable, to see how that changed the level of obedience. So this is his original study. The aim of Milgram's study was how far would people go in investigating an instruction, even though they knew it was harming a person. Now, let me fill in a little bit here about Milgram. Milgram actually was friends with Zimbardo. Just thought I'd throw that piece of useless information in there. But Milgram was a Jew, and this was, he became a psychologist, but he was really interested in, and actually part of his hypothesis was, are Germans evil? He wanted to look at the idea that Germans must have been evil by nature to carry out such atrocities. So that led him to doing this piece of research. Would a person obey a legitimate authority even though they know it's going to harm somebody? So he was interested to see. Now, when you look at the Second World War, you could always say, well, how done it with soldiers? They were following the legitimate authority. Years ago, that used to be a legitimate argument, but now that no longer exists within the courts. Just thought I'd throw that in there. So his aim was to see whether he could get normal everyday people to carry out an instruction even though they know it's going to harm somebody. So let's look at the sample that he had. Actually, I know it's not the best copy, but that is a copy of the actual advert that he put in newspapers. So he got a sample of American males aged between 20 and 50, so he's got a nice age group there. Occupation variable from unskilled to professionals. Now, Milgram didn't want to use the normal type of sample, which is university students. He wanted to use everyday American men. Actually, this is a good point of evaluation. it has a high level, I suppose, to a certain point of population validity because of the variety of occupations. It was normal everyday working men. Yes, we know we've got a low level of population validity because it was American and it was only males in his original study. We know that there. But with regards to having more of a general, he wanted just normal everyday. He didn't want academics. He didn't want people with who went to university with a, so therefore you've got a certain level of intelligence to be able to cope with the demands of it. It was a volunteer sample. He set out flyers and he put an advert in the local newspapers, and he got people to volunteer themselves. Yes, they were paid for this. It was $4, but then they were also given 50 cents for their transport to get there. Now, please note, when this was done, $4 was quite a bit of money, right? In the 1950s, when this was done, it was, you might kind of think $4. It's quite a lot of money. Again, here's another evaluations. Maybe people felt pressured because they accepted that payment, that they felt that they had to carry on. Otherwise, maybe they got their payment taken away. So just a little bit of an AO3 going on in there. So here we've got our sample. Now, the role of the participants. Now, original study, if we just flip back, you will see 40. So his original study was replicated 40 times. Each replication of the experiment, there was 2 participants. One was a Confederate, and he was known as Mr. Wallace. Now, we know what a Confederate is. A person who's part of the research, who's carrying out a role. And the other participant was a naive participant. He was totally unaware that Mr. Wallace was not a true participant. Now, they had to draw for the role. So they had to take lots. There was 2 pieces of paper and they both had to select one. Now, this was rigged. It was rigged in a way that the naive participant would always get the one that said teacher, and Mr. Wallace was always the student. There was another role, so there was a third, not participant, but a third individual who played the role, again, was a Confederate, as the experiment. And he was dressed with his lab coat. He looked legitimate. Right at the start, the participants were given the right to withdraw. So here we can see there's a lot of deception going along, because the naive participant is totally unaware of who it was. Now, please note, deception also occurred with the aim of the study, because the naive participant thought they were looking at the idea of memory. They were looking at the idea of memory and punishment. So quite different to what Milgram was looking at was obedience to a legitimate authority figure. Now, the room set up. I've got a nice little diagram next to you so you can see what it's all about. The learner was taken straight away. Once they had their lots taken, the learner, Mr. Wallace, was taken into a separate room and he was wired to a chair which had electrodes on it. It had to look legitimate. Here, deception occurred again. This was all pretend, because the learner, Mr. Wallace, didn't actually receive any electric shocks. But once they elected him, they gave him a 15-volt electric shock, which is a bit like static electricity you get from somebody else, and to make it look legitimate. Thereafter, all the sounds that the true participant heard was a recording. So that meant everybody else got the same noises from the so-called electric shocks. In the adjacent room, the teacher and the experimenter went, so there was a wall. The naive participant who played the role as a teacher could not see Mr. Wallace, the learner, but could only hear him. So he was put in front of a device, like you see in front of me. It had a whole collection of little switches. It started at 15 volts. Each one increased by 15 volts. Now, 15 volts isn't a big shock. However, it does go all the way up to 450 volts. And actually, that is fatal. If somebody gets 450 volts, they are dead. I mean, it's fatal before that. 300 volts is very severe damage, and thereafter, it could be fatal. But it increased by increments of 15 volts. The experiment sat on a table, just like you see in the little diagram, making note as if he's recording information and making notes. So he was playing the role. So there we've got the setup for what's happening. So every time the teacher asked a question and the learner got it wrong, he would then give him electric shock and then progress by 15 volts onto the next one. So every question that the learner got wrong, he got an electric shock. So let's look at the procedure more. The teacher asked the student a question, and if the student got the question wrong, the teacher would administer a shock. The shock increased by 15 volts, just like I've said. When the teacher got to 300 and 315 volts, the learner pounded the wall and thereafter gave no more responses. There wasn't a sound or any movement you could hear from the learner. When the teacher turned to the experiment to protest or look for guidance about going on, or if there was the absence of a response from the student, the experiment used to use a sequence of prods. Things like, please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. You have no other choice, but you must go on. So the experimenter gave these prompts. Now, these prompts came from the experimenter. Remember, the experimenter looked legitimate with regards to it. So what did they find? They found that all 40% participants went up to 300 volts. After that, it dropped down to 12 point, sorry, got that a wee bit wrong there. At 300 volts, 12.5% of participants, that was about 5 participants, didn't go any further. They refused to go any further. However, 65% continued up to 450 volts. Now, that was quite a severe percentage of participants. Actually, 65% went all the way to 450 volts. Now, when we've got the percentages, that's quantitative data, but they also are able to collect some qualitative data by looking at and observing how the participants behaved. And some were showing extreme stress like sweating, stuttering, biting their lips, digging their nails into their hands. Actually, 3 participants were hospitalized because they actually had full-blown seizures. So really, the stress upon the participants was quite extreme. Prior to Milgram's experiment, he asked psychology students, these were postgraduate psychology students, to make a prediction. How many participants did they predict would go all the way to 450 volts? They predicted only 3%. So that means a very small amount they predicted, because they believed this person would perhaps, or these few people would have some form of psychotic motives behind it. Right, sadistic motives behind it. So this prediction didn't actually mirror what Milgram actually found. Yes, all the participants were debriefed, and we hope were given the support that they needed. And they were given guidance to say actually how they were behaving, how they were reacting was perfectly normal. He also followed up with a questionnaire about the experiment, and 84% reported that they felt glad that they participated in this experiment. So really, Milgram did find that overall, people do follow the orders of a legitimate authority. If a person looks legitimate, they will follow. These findings actually shocked America, because America thought that Germans were bad people. Biologically, they were bad. But this showed that normal, everyday American men would actually harm somebody, because all of them harmed somebody because they all went up to 300 volts, just because they felt that they had to, because there was a legitimate authority there. So really, this was really socially sensitive research for its time. Again, that would be a nice AO3 there, talking about social sensitivity of the research. What we mean by social sensitivity, it doesn't just affect the experiment and the people within the experiment has a knock-on effect to the wider society. And here, it shocked Americans. They couldn't believe wholesome, everyday American men could carry out such brutal acts. So Milgram did conclude that people do obey to a legitimate authority. Now, let's do a little bit more AO3 with regards to ethical issues. Can you list the different ethical issues here? Pause here, pause, let's press pause and write down the ethical issues you think occur, and then in a moment we will compare. Are you ready to pause? Pause you go. Right, you've made your list. Let's do a little bit comparison. Deception, there was a lot of deception. For example, the aim of the study. The participants actually, there's a lot of deception there. They didn't know that Mr. Wallace was an actor. They didn't know, the participants didn't know that the experiment was a Confederate as well. Deception occurred about giving shocks. They thought they were giving actual shocks. Meanwhile, they weren't giving any. There was a fake, and all the sounds that they heard was a recording. So there was a lot of deception. Now, please note, if we have deception, we automatically have the lack of informed consent. So there is an issue there. But the big elephant in the room here is protection from harm. Look at the qualitative data that they got, both physically and psychologically. These people were harmed from the distress it caused to the seizures, to their thoughts. We can clearly see there was a lot of protection from harm. And also, throughout the research, they were, even though they were given the right to withdraw at the beginning, they weren't reminded of that throughout the experiment. And that's what should happen. In an experiment, participants on a regular basis should be given the right to withdraw. If they are feeling too stressed, remember the right to withdraw is a solution to perhaps one of the ethical issues. Like, for example, if a person's starting to feel too stressed, they should be able to say, I want to leave. So they weren't given that solution when they were experiencing their distress. So yes, there's a lot of ethical issues. Let's move on to validity. I'm going to look at two. These are two evaluations. Validity, we're going to look at both internal and external validity. So the study has what we call low levels of internal validity. Why? Orne and Holland, they actually stated, hold on, you know, people aren't daft, people aren't stupid. They believed that the participants really guessed that they weren't actually giving electric shocks. So they just went along with it because they were getting paid and it was the right thing for them to do. Also, Perry, she listened back to all the tapes from Milgram's original study, and many of the participants actually expressed doubt that they didn't really think they were giving the shocks. So internal validity is going to be an issue here. High external validity. Yes, I know you might think it's got a low level of external validity because it was a laboratory experiment and artificial environment. Yes, it has that. But what it does have is a high level of external validity because it shows the relationship between an authority figure, who was the experiment, the legitimate, remember he looked legitimate, and the participant. It does show that relationship, and we can see that in the greater world around us. Hoffling, oh, I do like Hoffling's research, actually supports this argument. Now, this was done in a hospital, so they took it out of the lab and they moved it into for a field experiment. So it was carried in a natural environment. What happened was nurses were on duty. Again, it would have been one nurse at a time. When she was on duty, she would receive a telephone call from a doctor that she'd never heard who he, or didn't know who he was, to give an instruction to give a patient a fatal dose of a drug. So the fatal dose was higher than what should actually state, and it was clearly stated on the box or the vial of the medicine. So they were given this instruction. Now the nurses knew that they were not allowed to take telephone instructions when it came to administering drugs. It had to be face to face. But what they found was 21 out of the 22 nurses that was in this field experiment. Remember, it was a field experiment. It was covert. They didn't know they were in that experiment until the end, until they were debriefed. 21 of them were going to administer that fatal level of drug. Only one of them didn't obey. So again, it looks at that. The doctor is seen as having a higher status compared to a nurse. They must know what's right, so they'll follow that instruction. And that fatal dose of the drug would have killed that patient. So again, Hoefling's research does support the idea of the legitimate authority figure. Now, your task. Let's get into your textbooks. Let's practice those peels. Really important to do those peels. Practice makes perfect. I know I say it over and over again. Right. I'll see you in the next session.